What's going on, everybody? I am good friend Trey of the NFL Best Bets podcast. Obviously not Thomas Tipple. He is out today celebrating a magical Canadian Thanksgiving. Chris Godwin doing Chris Godwin things. Dak Prescott forgot how to play football. Things are looking ugly in Dallas, but we're past that now. We're moving on to week 7, so we have the picks for you. Let's get after it. What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
All right, Jake, starting off as we typically do on this show with quarterback. You got a guy this week that you're looking into. Might be a little bit thinner at quarterback this week than we typically are accustomed to, but why don't you go ahead and tell us who you're liking this week at QB?
Yeah, there certainly isn't a lot of value on the board, at least at a first look at quarterback. But Sam Darnold does stick out, especially at just 6,200 on DraftKings. He faced a Jets defense in week 5 that ranked as a bottom 3 on paper matchup and as a top 3 run funnel. But if we exclude that league worst matchup, he's the quarterback 2 by fantasy points per dropback, ranking behind only Lamar Jackson, who actually isn't on the main slate. And not only is Detroit, who is Darnold's week 5 opponent, a massive pass funnel, they're also one of the few teams that can push the Vikings. Darnold averaged 20.6 DraftKings fantasy points per game in the first 4 weeks of the season, despite Minnesota gaining at least a 2-possession lead in each one of those games. As a result, we haven't seen this Minnesota offense truly get pushed. Darnold only attempted more than 28 passes in his brutal Week 5 matchup with the Jets. Now, the hyper-efficient Darnold will likely be forced to throw for the entirety of a high-total game. Given how condensed this Minnesota passing attack is, it should be easy to build lineups around Darnold this week.
Yeah, hopefully Darnold against the Lions will give you just a little bit more than Dak gave us here in week 6. Moving on to the running back position, Old Faithful, it looks like this week. Are we going back to the Kyren well?
Oh, yeah, we absolutely are. He's still 8,100 on DraftKings, so a fairly reasonable price for a guy who's seeing a fantastic workload. Kyren Williams is the RB1 by snap share, the RB1 by route share, and the RB3 by expected fantasy points. But what's even better than the workload is the matchup with the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders are the second softest schedule-adjusted matchup for opposing running backs, and the Rams are 5.5-point favorites here. Dating back to 2022, Williams averages 11 more fantasy points per game in wins relative to losses, and his per-snap productivity jumps 85% while leading compared to trailing. Positive game script is a huge part of what Kyren Williams needs to be successful, and he should have that on top of a great matchup this week.
Yeah, we do love it when Kyren is front running. The next play, his counterpart, I believe, is week to week at this point. That would be Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. Tell me more.
Yeah, so Tyjae Spears is not expected to play in week 7, and if that's the case, then Tony Pollard is going to get a monster workload here. Spears was injured on the first half's final play on Sunday, and after that injury, Pollard earned a 90% snap share, 85% of team rush attempts, and 92% of backfield usage as measured by expected fantasy points. The RB3 is Julius Chestnut, who has 13 career touches in just 3 seasons. He played on 3 of 29 snaps after Tyjae Spears left the game. So this is Pollard's backfield until Spears returns. And this isn't a bad week for Pollard to have a backfield monopoly. The Bills are among the 5 softest schedule-adjusted matchups for opposing running backs, mainly because they funnel such a massive amount of pass game volume underneath. Pollard's 56% route share after Spears left Sunday's game would rank as the 4th best among running backs over the full season. And the Tennessee backfield has recorded the 12th most receptions on the year. Pollard should get peppered with targets here on top of an every down role, and that makes him one of the most obvious values of week 7, priced at just 6,300 on DraftKings.
I like it. We're going to move over to wide receiver and keep it rolling with fantasy points darling Diontae Johnson. I mean, the guy can't miss. We're going back.
Of course we are. Yeah, the usage for Diontae has been absolutely awesome with Andy Dalton. He's averaged 21 expected fantasy points per game and 18 actual fantasy points per game since Dalton took over. Over the full season, those numbers would rank 3rd best and 8th best among wide receivers, which makes Diontae, a pretty obvious value at just 6,600 on DraftKings. That's the wide receiver 18 by salary. For the last month, he's been one of the most glaring usage and productivity based values in all of DFS, and I really don't think that's going to change against a struggling Washington. Pass defense, the Commanders are the fourth softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing wide receivers, and Carolina is a 7.5 point underdog here. Andy Dalton should be pushed towards 40 dropbacks in this game, and Johnson has scored 82% of his fantasy points this season in just the 3 games Dalton has attempted at least 35 passes. The projected volume and matchup for Johnson suggests his DraftKings price should be at least $800 higher in a great matchup where, again, Carolina should be forced to throw.
And the 2023 Ass Master, Tank Dell, throwing it back. No pun intended. We like Tank Dell this week, do we?
Yeah, absolutely. So he's a very similar price to Diontae Johnson. I think this mid-range is overall pretty strong. He's 6,500. That's the wide receiver 19 on DraftKings. And it really shouldn't be a shock. But Tank Dell earned his best usage of the season on Sunday without Nico Collins, 24.3 expected fantasy points, ranking behind only DK Metcalf and Chris Godwin in wide receiver expected fantasy points. Now, that usage only amounted to 18.7 actual fantasy points, but it's obvious Dell is now at the forefront of the league's most productive wide receiver room by total fantasy points scored. He did lead the team in first read targets last week, and this usage should only improve in week 7, facing Green Bay in the 4th highest total game of the slate. The Packers are actually a major outside funnel. They've allowed the 7th most schedule adjusted fantasy points to outside wide receivers, but they're a bottom 10 matchup for opposing slot. Tank Dell runs 75% of his routes on the outside. Packers are also bottom 6 in pressure rate, and Tank Dell has seen his targets per route run rise 55% on unpressured dropbacks dating back to last year. But I could rattle off advanced stats all day. The reality is he's simply too cheap given the matchup and the absence of Nico Collins.
Yeah, Nico being out opens a lot of doors there in Houston. Moving over to finish with the tight ends. We had a little bit of a resurgence this week from some of the top guys. Not sure if it's going to stick. We shall see. But there is one guy who you think we can lean on consistently.
Yeah, so tight end's generally a disaster. I mean, it has been all season. Things are slowly improving, and it's at least partially thanks to one of these awesome rookie tight ends in Brock Bowers. He currently leads the position in first read targets, targets per out run, and receiving yards per game. He ranks barely behind George Kittle for the positional lead in usage and productivity. He leads the position in targets of 15 plus air yards and in design targets like screens. The combination of a downfield role and guaranteed short area targets is a lethal one for fantasy, and it provides Bowers with a floor and ceiling combo that nearly no other tight end at the position can match. Now, of course, on DraftKings this week, Bowers isn't the most expensive tight end. He's only 5,800, the tight end 3, and while his week 7 matchup is merely a neutral one, the tight end position, like I've said, is largely a disaster. It's been very difficult to find consistent production, and Bowers is a strong case to be the position's most expensive player just a month and a half into his NFL career. It looks like if I'm going to be paying up at tight end this week, Bowers is going to be my favorite way to do it.
I love that. Looks like we're in and out in a quick 8 minutes or so. Make sure you head over to the website to check out Jake's article this week. Jake will be trying to cash while I am continuing to crash. That's how I like to operate. So make sure you take Jake's advice, plug a couple of these guys into your lineups in week 7 for Jake Tribbey. I am good friend Trey Kamberling. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like, subscribe. You know what to do. And we will see you at the top of the leaderboards.